Welcome to Off Panel.
Yo, everybody, welcome to Off Panel. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the writer of the Flintstones, as well as the upcoming Snagglepuss book at DC Comics. It's Mark Russell. Thanks for coming on, Mark.
Oh, my pleasure.
So, I want to have you on because I really, really love your work, but I wanted to talk about your path to comics because I know, I did a lot of research, reading interviews, things like that, and I could find very little about what you did before God is Disappointed in You, your book at Top Shelf. So, were you writing before you got into comics, or were you doing other things entirely?
Yeah, I was writing. I've been writing for decades, mostly toiling in obscurity. God is Disappointing You was my first book, but I'd written books before that that never got published, and I had published my own work in a zine called The Penny Dreadful,
Nice.
which is long out of print. But yeah, God is Disappointing You was sort of my first um, major publisher release, and yeah, I've been writing for as long as I can remember. It's just that my publishing career, my career as a published author is relatively short.
I think that's one of the funny things that happens a lot when people quote unquote come out of nowhere. We really just don't see the path that led them to that point.
Yeah, it's really never from out of nowhere. I mean, most people, especially writers, I think, spend a long time honing their craft.
Yeah.
Like decades writing and stuff that nobody wants to read, and and then one thing latches on to. One thing catches on, and then they are able to find readers for their work.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to talk about, your comics spend a lot of time, looking at and tackling economic, societal, political issues in a way that few do. You clearly have a worldview that you bring into your work. I'm curious, what's the genesis of that? Do you have a background in those worlds at all, or is that just something that kind of interests you about kind of how the world works?
Yeah, I'm just an amateur. I just take an interest in the world around me, and I feel strongly that for me, writing is not so much an art form as it is a means of communication.
Sure.
So I like to write about things other than writing, or I like to write about things other than trying to artfully tell a story. I like to write about the world as I see it.
Mm-hmm. I love that the first thing that you actually had published was effectively redoing the Bible the right way this time.
Yeah, not ostentatious at all.
Well, no, I mean, it's funny because I was actually reading through some the Amazon reviews and stuff like that, because with something like that based off of a 10,000 foot view of like that, you would expect some people to be pretty grumpy about it, but everybody was like, it actually made the Bible a lot more enjoyable, and I'm religious.
Yeah. That was kind of the most gratifying response I got to God is Disappointing You, is that even religious people liked it. So I was a little worried that people wouldn't get what I was going for, or that it would be too nice to the Bible for the non-believers and too mean to the Bible for believers to enjoy. But really, I'm not really trying to do either. I'm not trying to endorse the Bible or attack it.
Sure.
I'm really just trying to be as blunt as I can be about this is what I think it says.
Mm-hmm.
And luckily, the opposite was true. The people who didn't grow up with the Bible, non-believers, were really kind of fascinated by the opportunity to read a book about the Bible that didn't have an agenda.
Mm-hmm.
And believers were also kind of intrigued because they wanted to see the Bible through other eyes, and they appreciated the fact that I wasn't trying to. I wasn't like aggressively trying to assassinate the Bible. I was just sort of trying to be honest about what I thought its value was,
Mm-hmm.
and because I do find value in the Bible, I think they appreciated it.
Yeah, the amazing thing is it seems like you easily could have fallen in a middle ground where you either simultaneously made everyone upset or you made everyone feel nothing, and you didn't. You managed to avoid that, which is a hell of a thing, so to speak.
Yeah, I was very. I think I was very lucky to get the reaction I did to the book, and yeah, I'm very happy the way it turned out. in the way it was received.
I can tell you that the follow-up had one of the greatest titles in the history of anything. I love the name Apocrypha now. That is so incredible.
That was actually I actually kind of had a naming contest on Facebook,
Mm.
and a friend of mine, a fellow writer named Mo Davia, came up with the name for the book. She had the winning entry, so I actually thank her in the special thanks section of the Apocrypha Now for coming up with the title.
It's genius. But I was actually reading an interview with you where you described God is Disappointed in You as not really a comic, but a book with cartoons in it, which is very much true. So one of the things I think is interesting about you is actual sequential comic books were new to you with Prez. Is that correct?
Yeah, that was the first comic book I ever wrote.
Did you have any personal background with comics as like a fan, or were you kind of diving straight into it, the deep end with that with Prez?
Mostly the latter. I mean, I'd read Alan Moore, and I was a big fan of Daniel Clowes, but I'd never, as a medium, I never really embraced comics. I never was a huge comic book collector, and other than the few things I knew were good, I never really dived into the medium beyond a few authors that I liked.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I was kind of an ingenue in comics. I really didn't know what I was doing. In a lot of ways, I think I still don't, and that's probably my charm, such as it is as a comic writer, is that I don't know what I'm doing. I'm That's probably why I sound different. It's not by design. It's not by stylistic choice. It's just the virtue of my ignorance.
I was actually thinking about that. A lot of people who come into comics have spent their entire life reading comics. They have this long running personal continuity with comics where Alan Moore's and the Grant Morrisons and the Stan Lee's and the whomevers have influenced their brain for forever. And sometimes, like, people say that comics, like a lot of modern comics, are effectively fan fiction, and that is reality in a lot of cases. That's what kind of all of comics are to a certain degree. But I'm kind of curious, do you feel like your approach is different from the way some of your peers write comics because you don't hold what came before you on as high of a pedestal?
Yeah, I think it is because, yeah, like you say, it's not, with me. It's not fan fiction. In fact, I'd never even heard of. I had no idea who the character Prez was until they asked me if I was interested in writing it.
Mm-hmm.
I think for me, the process is kind of backwards. Like, I'm more like, I have things I want to say, or things I think, or things I'm interested in about the world around me, and depending upon what I'm writing, I will tie it to the things that I think are relevant to the character or the premise from the world. So I don't really write about the characters. I more write about the world and let the characters be my lens
Mm-hmm.
through which I talk about it.
Yeah. I actually think it's funny you said that you didn't really know that much about Prez. I've been reading comic books my entire life, and I've heard of Prez. I'd heard of Prez in some general capacity. I read while reading interviews with you that there was actually Prez was in Sandman #4. I've actually never read Sandman, so I've never read a single Prez comic before I read yours, which I think is kind of interesting. That is one of the nice things about where you're coming into as far as Prez is concerned is for 99.9% of readers or even potential readers, Prez was a blank slate.
Yeah, that's probably true. And yeah, there wasn't a lot. I think in a lot of ways, I've benefited from the fact that I've been given titles which there's not a lot of fan investment already.
Sure.
There's not a lot of. They're not terribly worried about continuity or that I will somehow break something
Mm-hmm.
or that I'll drop the crown jewels in the gutter. I think that's kind of become my niche at DC. I'm not the guy you give the keys to the Lamborghini to. I'm the guy you give the keys to the broken down VW bus to. And if I get it running, great. If not, then no loss. And I think that was kind of why I was able to write Prez the way I did and the Flintstones, because nobody really cared.
Right.
It wasn't going to hurt anything if I failed.
Mm-hmm. That's actually a pretty sweet niche to be in. I mean, it
Yeah,
gives you the
it's not
opportunity.
bad. It's not bad at all.
I think it's great, but I wanted to actually ask about like the origin story of Prez. How you hadn't worked in sequential comics when you were hired for Prez. You'd only done God Is Disappointed in You. Apocrypha Now, I don't believe was out yet. How exactly did you get hired for Prez?
Yeah, it was. This is not really for anyone listening for tips on how to get in the comic. This isn't really the way it's done. It was kind of an outlier, a little bit of a fluke. A friend, well, Shannon, who did the cartoons for God's Disappointing You, has a friend who was an editor at DC,
Mm-hmm.
who turned out to be Marie Javins, my editor. And she had a copy of God Is Disappointed in You. So when they were having talks about, well, who do we know that can write satire? We're looking at doing this political comic, the run up to the election. Who do we know can write something sort of satirical? I luckily was kind of on the tip of her tongue because she had the book in the office, and fortuitously, we had become friends on Facebook by virtue of my friend Shannon.
Mm-hmm.
And fortuitously, when they were looking for somebody to write this Prez comic, I had been posting sort of Frankenberry fan fiction on Facebook, which she thought was kind of funny. So she, while they were talking about who they might ask to write the Prez comic, she was reading my Frankenberry and Count Chocula fan fiction, which I wrote. I wrote these little stories about Frankenberry and Count Chocula and Blueberry as if they were like in Game of Thrones. So they're all backstabbing and betraying each other. But she read that, and then it reminded her of my book that I'd written, and she proposed me, and they said, "Why not? Let's give this man a chance."
That's amazing. That is like you said, it's not exactly a breaking in story that's easy to emulate. It's like,
yeah, I can't really tell people, oh yeah, just write some Frankenberry fan fiction and you'll get discovered.
You never know. I mean, I actually recently had somebody on my show who went from writing a fan comic for Spider-Man, and then I think within like a year or two, basically was writing and drawing her own comic in an issue of Amazing Spider-Man.
Yeah. I think that in a lot of ways, whenever you write something, it's sort of like writing your own lottery ticket.
Mm-hmm.
And chances are it will come to nothing. But there's also, the more you put out there, the more lottery tickets you buy, the greater the chance that somebody's going to notice it and you're going to hit the jackpot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things I always find surprising about that, because I completely agree with that premise, is it never really seems to be the lottery ticket you think it's going to be. Not that you could ever really know, but
right,
it's like you didn't go onto Facebook and say, I'm going to make these Frankenberry fan comics for the explicit purpose of being hired by DC Comics.
Yeah, I wasn't. I didn't realize I was auditioning.
So in another interview I read with you, you spoke about the fundamental mission of comics and how they were meant to, identify what is wrong with the world and create characters who can set it right. I thought that was a really great perspective, and it's also something that very few comics actually do. I mean, a lot of it is like it's entertainment. I think you described it as basically like wrestling, and I think that's accurate. When you're taking on a new project like Prez or the Flintstones, is that a central thought that guides you as you develop it?
Yeah, I kind of I think less about like what is, about creating a character that can make the world right. I think more in terms of like, well, what is it that this character or the premise of this comic connects to about the world that I find interesting.
Mm-hmm.
It's more like Prez obviously was politics, and setting it 20 years in the future gave me a chance to sort of create this dystopian cautionary tale of where I think the country was going. In fact, not many people know this, but I actually wrote it in 2015 with the idea that it was set in a post-Trump presidency world.
Wow.
If you look at like issue number 4, there's a like a border wall.
Oh yeah.
And there's references, to I don't know, things like the welfare, all welfare programs being replaced by Taco Drone, and these sorts of things that I thought were very Trumpian maxims. The country's basically become a playground for billionaires, and the EPA is all but non-existent. And so, yeah, it was very much sort of imagining it as sort of a post-Trump presidency set in this brightly colored but still dystopic future.
Mm-hmm. I have to admit, when I was rereading it for this interview, I saw the border wall and I was like, damn, that was a good call by him. Little did I know that you actually kind of planned it that way.
Yeah, I at the time I thought I was writing science fiction.
Yeah, that is actually one of the things I was going to ask you about is have you ever watched Veep by chance?
Yeah, I like the.
Yeah, Veep's great, and the guy who's running the show now is David Mandel, I think it is. And I was reading an interview with him, and he was talking about how they were actually really thankful that they moved Selena Meyer out of the White House because of how difficult it would have been to top the insanity of the current state of politics.
Yeah,
And
right.
I know that the second half of Prez was canceled, but I kind of wonder if you actually had the chance to do that again. It's like I think you'd actually written the second half already. I wonder if you would have almost had to have rewritten it because has the bar been moved on what satire can be in today's political climate?
Well, it's a good question, but I don't think I would. I mean, I'd written 2 issues in the second run of 6 issues when it was canceled, and I don't think I would rewrite those. I think I would stick by them because I think they're about problems that are still pretty endemic in society. But I might change the way I write the remaining 4 issues because I feel like they're the future that we will likely inherit is looking even more bleak than I had originally sort of envisioned.
Mm-hmm. It is fascinating how the future of Prez that you laid out is like if you look at it, it just kind of looks like today if technology had flourished and we continue down the path of like kind of insensitivity to each other's needs. But in a lot of ways, because it's so colorful and because the way that Ben renders everything, it kind of feels like I don't know. It's like a dystopia that is kind of cleverly disguised as some people's utopia.
Well, I think dystopia will be cleverly disguised. I think we almost do us a disservice by always painting dystopias as being gray and oppressive and dull. I think an American dystopia will look like a Taco Bell.
Thus the taco drones.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of like Ben got that right away, and I think that's why. And the artwork looks sort of cartoony, and the color palettes are kind of like a lot of purples and golds, and it's that this is an attractive dystopia until you look at the misery under the surface.
Yeah, there's a lot of depth to the world, and the more you dig into the depth, the more you're like, wow, this isn't great. Like you're like, oh, we have like these kind of AI driven nurses that are actually only here to kill us. That's not ideal.
Well, and I think that they're there to help assist people that are dying by helping them die quicker.
Right.
But yeah, I think that since the dawn of humanity, there's basically 2 reasons, or at least 2 applications that come to mind. Like as soon as a new technology is created, it's like, oh well, how can I use this to have sex or kill people?
Right.
And those are pretty much the 2 first questions that come to. I think that people try to answer when there's a new development in technology, and that's also the case in Prez. Like all this new future technology, I mean, it might have other applications that might do some good, and it might have applications that are more altruistic and noble. But at the same time, the overwhelming number, I think, majority of uses for new technologies will be either as weapons or as something that will make you more attractive or help you get laid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So,
I'm trying. I think that the original origin of Viagra was actually as like heart medicine.
yeah, and and if it stayed heart medicine, you would never have heard of it.
Exactly. So I wanted to ask actually about collaboration because on God is Disappointed in You, you worked with Shannon Wheeler, who is a friend of yours, a comic veteran, Too Much Coffee Man, et cetera, et cetera. But it wasn't it wasn't sequential comics. You worked with Ben Caldwell, who was a total revelation to me on the book. I know he had done stuff before, but man, he was just incredible on Prez. But what was the learning curve writing for sequentials for you, and also like what was the experience of working with Ben like? Did he make things easier on you?
Yeah. Well, Ben's a great artist, so I really enjoyed getting his art, and he was also very good at like putting in his own sort of background, the details. So I think he made Prez feel a lot more layered and textured and full than it would have without him. For me, I think I drove him crazy a little bit at first because this is my first comic book, so I didn't know things. I would try to cram pages too full with like panels and different scenes, and I would try to like write too many details into the panels instead of trusting his artistic creativity to like. And it's one thing I learned pretty quickly is like not to overpopulate the page with panels and not to only basically tell the artist what I needed, what was essential to the panel, and then
Mm-hmm.
let them surprise me with their own creativity when let them put as much of their own spin on it as possible. When I did that with Ben, I was rewarded, and I feel like I've taken the same approach with Steve and Pugh and doing the Flintstones, and he's also been really, really good because I've allowed him so much leeway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean I feel like that's one of the things that writers learn in a hurry when they're first getting into comics is like how much you can put in there and having to trust your artist. And that was one of the things I think is amazing about Prez is because there's so much on every single page that you can take in. Like a good example is the debates that they would have on DCNN where there'd be like the who's winning the debate, the percentage and everything like that. Like details like that, or even what the host's hair looked like, where it was like this weird disc and all this stuff like that. It's hard to tell where you stop and Ben starts. Like, so how detailed were you in your scripts as far as details, like the elements I'm talking about?
I came up with a lot of the. I would put a lot of the background jokes in there, but Ben came up with a lot too. In fact, the two you mentioned, like the hairstyles, amber waves, and
Mm-hmm.
the sort of like percentages that show somebody's winning a debate real time. Those are both Ben's innovations.
Mm-hmm.
So we both came up with like a lot of like sort of like background gags or that to throw in there. But I think it's one of the things that made the Prez world feel as developed as it did, is that it wasn't just like moving from one panel to the next, moving the story forward, but it actually populates this world that we had created together,
Mm-hmm.
and you feel like you're in a place that's real because of these background details.
Mm-hmm. The $1 million question though is who came up with Farmaduke?
That was me. I'm going to take credit for that.
Oh my god, that
Yeah,
is so
that was
good.
when I knew that this was going to be an unusual comic. When they let me, when I said, okay, I want to have a logo for a pharmaceutical company called Pharmaduke, and I want the logo to be the head of a Great Dane with a syringe in his mouth. And they didn't bat an eye. They're like, okay.
Yeah, I think the last question I want to ask about Prez is related to that because one of the things that I think is most interesting about comics these days is the perception that major publishers' editorial staffs are basically filled with jerks who ruin stories and fun. But on Prez, even on the Flintstones, you seem like completely unleashed. Like you can do pretty. I mean, I'm not saying that there haven't been things that they've said no to, but you've gotten away with a lot of things I would normally expect to see a DC on the cover of. What was the experience of developing both Prez and the Flintstones like with your editorial staff, and how open were your editors to taking the book in directions that they may not have expected?
Well, I think Marie and Dan DiDio both wanted both the Flintstones and Prez to be edgy, to be daring, to push
Mm-hmm.
the envelope a little bit. So they encouraged me as far as that went. Marie would stop me occasionally when I was writing something that would A, get them sued for copyright infringement, or B, that violated the teen rating because it was too obscene.
Sure.
Although I think if she'd had her way, she would have let me get away with them. But legal would sometimes pull the brakes on it because we had said something that was too racy for a rated teen comic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would understand that there's some things that are bridged too far, but I was kind of amazed by what you got away with, especially given the fact, like I said, quite often editorial, it's like their name kind of only appears if it's something terrible, and
Yeah,
it seems like they were pretty great to work with.
Yeah, I had the a really good experience with Marie and the rest of the DC editorial staff. And not only did they enable me to write the way I wanted to write and to go places that I probably shouldn't have been allowed to go, but she really kind of taught me about the art of writing comics, about what you can and can't put in, about how to like let things happen between the panels,
Mm-hmm.
and about how to not drive your artist crazy by trying to cram so much in. And so yeah, I think that working with an editor in a way kind of made the work freer and
Mm-hmm.
liberated the work.
So I want to talk about Flintstones next, and one of my favorite things I discovered while preparing for this is the fact that you were not a fan of the series growing up. Considering that, why did you take the job? And was the idea of taking it in a much different direction than the Hanna-Barbera cartoon your idea, or was that something that DC kind of had a general idea that they wanted to go with before you got there?
Well, they definitely wanted something that was irreverent. They wanted something that wasn't going to just be this sort of really safe recreation of the Flintstones. That would have been a disaster in DC's eyes, I
Mm-hmm.
think. And I think that's one of the reasons why they gave it to me, because they knew I was the guy who was they known from I was known as the guy who was continually crashing the VW bus they let me drive when I was doing Prez. So like, oh yeah, we don't have to worry about that guy playing it too safe. Um, and the For me, I was reluctant to take the Flintstones at first, but then I just thought, I'm interested in actually a lot of things that the Flintstones talks about. I'm
Mm-hmm.
interested in the ancient human civilizations. I wrote a book about ancient human civilizations, and I'm interested in the sort of economics. So this is like the first civilization that had money,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm interested in I could talk about like how the formation of religion, these other sort of social institutions getting off the ground for the first time. So the more I thought about it, the more I thought like this is actually really appealing to me, even though I never really enjoyed the Flintstones, as a cartoon. The idea of being able to write about the world's first civilization and what they got right and what they got wrong,
Mm-hmm.
that greatly appealed to me.
Yeah. One of my favorite things about the book is when I emailed you about coming on the show, I initially said the word reinvent. But the funny thing about the Flintstones is the more I thought about it is it doesn't really reinvent anything. It just kind of takes a different spin on everything we already knew about it. Like, Fred still says yabba dabba do, but it's now like this kind of mantra he says to kind of get over some pain in his life. And
Yeah, a
then,
lot of it is just about like what the Flintstones would be like in the real world.
right. Yeah. So like there's all kinds of elements like that. Like a great example is the reality of the lives of the appliances, which is one of those things that you watch as a kid and you don't really think about how kind of inhumane it is, just kind of monstrous really. But then you actually, you put it in there and you're like, what? How did I never think of this? What was the process like in developing your version of the story? Was it more looking at this world and seeing what twists you could take on existing ideas rather than reinventing the world entirely?
There were a few things like that where it's like, oh, in fact, the Animal Planet was one of the very first things I thought I wanted to write about the Flintstones. There are a few tweaks and adaptations I wanted to do of the Flintstones world, but mostly it was about wanting to talk about civilization, and it's sort of like the sort of horrible things that have to be done in order to make civilization a place where we can get fast food.
Mm-hmm.
The 99-cent Whopper is built upon centuries of exploitation and misery. And I say that as somebody who loves fast food, who loves all the good things that civilization provides, but but I have to remind myself of like the price tag for that is more than just what I pay at the store. And thinking about that on a civilizational level allows us, I think, to sort of envision something better going forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you touch on all those things in very real ways. I actually, one of the things that appears both in Prez and the Flintstones, when I was rereading it, they're like direct comments from both Beth Ross's Secretary of State and the Great Gazoo about how to about how, and to paraphrase, humans have struggled with life at the top of the food chain. And I thought that was something that kind of feels like the umbrella for a lot of the stuff you tackle, where it's like, we've gotten to this point where we're at the top and we kind of don't really care about how we live to continue that going on. We don't even really know what to do once we're there. We're just there and we're just trying to make it through life. And it ties into politics and religion and society and commerce. How much of that is your worldview peeking out, and how much is you kind of, amplifying your take for the purpose of, making the satire more clear?
Oh, I believe in all of it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I believe in everything I say in the comics. I do think the human race is kind of like a species of bad winners. Like,
yeah.
We evolved as prey, as like
mm-hmm.
being in the middle of the food chain, where we had to, we were greedy and we would and opportunistic because we had to be in order to survive. We had to like be paranoid because there were actually lions and snakes and other predators out to kill us, and it served us very well when we were at the middle of the food chain. But then once we cracked the enigma of agriculture and industrialization, this sort of paranoia made us an extremely murderous, warlike species. This greediness turned us into consumers run amok, who are in rapidly we're rapidly becoming to the point where we're destroying our own playground because of our own rapacious appetites.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I one of the things that kind of makes me think about is Louis C.K. did this bit where he was talking about how, I think it was actually a bit that was in Louis, the show itself, but he was talking about how his, I think it was his niece came to visit him or something like that in New York, and she got off a bus and she was from middle of nowhere, United States, and they were walking by and there was all these homeless people on the ground, and she went up to them and she was like, do you need help? Do you need my assistance? Do you need anything? And he went and grabbed her and was like, what are you doing? No, you can't do that. That's wrong. You don't do that. And he realized, he talked about it in there. He was like, I realized that it was really strange that I was talking down to her when there was she's doing the right thing. And I'm like, no, you can't do that. We actually have gotten to the point, like you said, where we're kind of bad winners and where we kind of don't really look out for each other because we're only looking out for ourselves.
Yeah, we narrow the range. I mean, as we surround ourselves with our own comforts and our own, sort of comfortable, well-fed lives, we narrow the range of what we'll accept as tragedies and as possibilities.
Mm-hmm.
And anything that falls outside the range of that is uncomfortable to us. And I think that's the main reason why people are antipathetic towards homeless people, is because they remind us of what we would be if we didn't have access to a house and showers. It's that's kind of where we would all be within a week,
right,
of not being able to afford a home.
Mm-hmm.
And it's scary. It's scary to us to remind us how our luxuries and our way of life are all kind of so fragile.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, one of the things that's interesting about the Flintstones is it can be a pretty sad feeling book in some ways, but there's always a twinge of pain in the relationships and the histories of these characters, but it's also very funny. Now that's one of the tricky parts about the approach, I'm guessing, but how important is finding a balance between those elements so it doesn't become too heavy in one direction or the other?
Yeah, I as a rule, I tend to write about things that break my heart and that make me laugh, and luckily for me, they're usually kind of the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that the humor largely comes from saying things that people will acknowledge as true. They just don't think you should probably say out loud.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not much of a sacrifice to me. It's not sort of a zero-sum game where, this can be sad or heavy, or it can be funny, so maybe I should make it funny here. It's more kind of I think the worse things get in the Flintstones, and the harsher the reality is, by nature, the funnier it gets.
Yeah, Absolutely. And it's I don't know. There's I don't want to get into spoiler moments, but there's like some relationships in it that it's like the nature of like a lot of the appliances are both very tragic and also very humorous in the way that you handle it. And it is kind of interesting how like those moments can happen panel to panel, page to page, issue to issue. It just changes depending on how it's being delivered. And I don't know. I think you handle it very well.
Thank you. Yeah, yeah. I think that what people are looking, I think that the higher the stakes are, the more you get people invested in characters, the more they will laugh when something funny happens, and the more they will feel the chill of tragedy when something bad happens. So I think it really all kind of starts there, getting people invested in your characters, recognizing themselves in the characters you created.
I actually wanted to ask about, one of the sadder pairs out of there. I'm a huge vacuum cleaner and bowling ball fan. One of the
Feels
things,
weird to say that, doesn't it?
I know it does. I'm just like vacuum cleaner and bowling. I'm like, is there a better thing I can call them? I guess they don't have names. I can't.
No, that's intentional. They're not supposed to have names. They've been reduced to their economic function. So that's all vacuum cleaner knows himself as is vacuum cleaner.
Which is why Dino's the police.
Yeah, he's like Uncle Tom.
Yeah, exactly.
Everyone hates Dino.
Yeah. But one of the things I find the most interesting about both Prez and the Flintstones is how you could argue that the most like emotionally resonant storylines both or of each involve non-human entities. Like I care so much about Vacuum Cleaner and Bowling Ball. And then also Tina, like Tina the War Beast in Prez, you have like this emotional investment in, like, you don't even have that really with Beth as much as you do with Tina. I was curious, was finding humanity in the non-human characters a very deliberate choice, or is it just something I'm reading into as like a super fan of Bowling Ball and Vacuum Cleaner?
No, I think it's easier to write humanity into animals and robots and things because they're innocent in a way that we are not.
Right.
I mean, I see a dog get smacked on the head with a rolled up newspaper. I think it's horrible, that poor dog. I see a person get smacked on the head with a rolled up newspaper. I think they probably had it coming.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think we already invest non-human actors with the sense of innocence that we don't invest other people with.
Mm-hmm. I mean, War Beast is a perfect example. I mean, she was literally born into war, and there's like that is her sole function in life. Or excuse me, Tina, that is her sole function in life, and she didn't have a choice in the matter. So when she gets a choice, once she starts downloading movies and watching and realizing that life isn't just like, I don't know, violent holocausts on societies, then she starts making those choices. And it is really fascinating because like you actually enable her with those choices.
Yeah, she was just the product of the way she had been, of her own usefulness in that society she lived in, as are we all.
Mm-hmm.
And her really only existential choice was to if she was going to live an authentic life, was to turn her back on the entire world as she had known it,
mm-hmm.
which is incredibly hard to do for anybody. And it's, in a way, it's the most moral decision a person can possibly make. The most terrifying moral crisis a person can have. That in order to do the right thing, you have to completely reject your raison d'etre.
Mm-hmm. Well, and she also, like, her life doesn't leave her behind. So it is, well, eventually it does when she cuts her deal. But at first it's like, I don't know, that scene where the people that created her come for her when she's in the church is like weirdly funny. I like when she's like, would you guys mind laying on the floor for a second or whatever she says? I remember reading that and laughing at first, and I was like, oh, this is actually kind of dark.
Yeah, she kind of, they don't realize what they're getting themselves into, because this is precisely what she was designed for, and they're fighting her, in her home, in a way that she is used to fighting.
I love the way that the church actually notifies their people that there's a killer robot living with them now, is that they just put killer robot on that weird magnetized sign that they have outside of churches.
Oh yeah, the church reader board is like really, it's where everything good goes to live.
Yeah,
it's where you find out about everything. I don't want to live in a world without church reader boards.
There is some pretty interesting messages that can go up on them sometimes. I have just a few more questions. I wanted to ask about like the licensing part of things, because I read that that licensing originally wanted Fred in the Flintstones to say "yabba dabba do" basically every issue. You know, it's his catchphrase. It's kind of what he's known for. But you spin it in your own way. Were you surprised at all that you could, you know, what you could get away with such a notable? I mean, the Flintstones is extremely well known, but you got to spin something that's even so well known like Yabba Dabba Doo in your own way. Were you surprised what you could get away with?
Yeah, I was, and I think again it's a testament to how much DC really wanted to do something edgy and do something a little different. And so I'm grateful to them for taking a chance on career suicide with me. But yeah, I mean, there are very few times where, there are very few times when they had to sort of pull the brakes on me. And usually when they did, I kind of understood their reasoning. I wasn't bitter about it. I never felt like, oh man, the suits don't get this, and they're trying to keep me down. And
yeah, it seems like you would kind of have like the way you were doing it is you were kind of always writing the line, and you knew it. So if they had to do it, it was understandable.
Yeah, and usually there was like wasn't like because they thought the message was too subversive or anything like that. It was more just kind of like, no, you'll get us sued, or. No, well, this violates our rated teen rating.
Yeah. So with Steve Pugh as the artist on the book, and he's done a phenomenal job. It's it's obviously different than Prez, because Prez was like taking our world and building on it 20 years in the future. It didn't have anything that was like known in like the visual lexicon of like, you know, the zeitgeist and everything like that. When you were working with Steve, or when you were originally developing Flintstones, did you and Steve talk about how you wanted to make Bedrock look and all the characters and everything like that? How close was that relationship as you were developing it?
Yeah, we had some conversations before he started drawing about the characters, in particular about what we want to look like. And what I wanted to avoid was the way the cartoon sort of treated Fred as like this buffoon, or sort of, funny fat guy. I wanted him to seem like a real person, like somebody who had gone, you might have been on your football team in high school, and then he went to war and then came back different. I wanted him to feel like an actual human being, and I don't like how the sort of traditional sitcom trope of like some homely dude marrying this really hot model wife, and her just kind of like being like the moral compass of this guy, and like him being like a cut up that we're all sort of has terrible ideas, but we all sort of like secretly sympathize with anyway. And the wife is just this nag. I wanted to get away from all of those really tired and sexist sort of sitcom tropes. And I wanted to reinvent Fred and Wilma as like sort of real people that you might actually know, with a viewpoint and a worldview of their own.
Also with incredible guns. That's one of my favorite things. I don't know if that was you.
He's stacked, isn't he?
Yeah, I don't know if that was you or Steve, but it makes so much sense that like everybody in Bedrock would have crazy like guns for arms, because they're doing manual labor quite often in ways that we don't really do these days. Like I can have like thin little arms because I sit at a desk and tap at a keyboard all day, but they work in a quarry, and while the dinosaurs carry a lot, it makes sense they would have muscular arms.
Yeah, they had Neanderthal strong calves. Constant working out.
Except for Bam Bam, who has just got that natural tree people strength, right? Or is it lizard people?
No,
he's tree people.
He's a tree person, yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things I hear all the time is, wow, you won't believe how good the Flintstones is. And I think that's really funny. I was at Emerald City Comic Con recently, and I had a prominent comic artist tell me straight up that Flintstones is his favorite comic, and it seems like really commonly held. And I think the funny thing is going in, you had two camps. You had people who were like, oh, I like the Flintstones, maybe I'll check that out, and then a bunch of people being like, why is DC publishing a Flintstones comic? I wanted to ask about the expectations versus reality on it. Did you go in and think it was going to be kind of a hard sell given the reality of what you were going for, or is it something that you planned on playing off from the start?
No, I realized it was going to be a hard sell, and I felt like every conversation I had with people about the fact that I was writing the Flintstones kind of started with an apology. Like, look, I'm writing the Flintstones, but it's not going to be terrible. I swear. Please just give it a chance. Like, because I knew that the expectations were horrible, and if somebody else told me that they were writing a Flintstones comic, I would be just as skeptical.
Mm-hmm.
If I heard someone else was writing a Flintstones comic, I'd probably roll my eyes and ask, why do we need this too? But it's taught me a lesson. It's taught me to not judge work based upon the premise, but that people. What's important, I think, people think that what makes them profound is what they're into, but it's really not. I think what depth is all dependent upon what you get out of something.
Mm-hmm.
And so even if you're reading a Garfield adventure comic or whatever, it can still be deeply moving and a deep experience depending upon what you're getting out of it. And so to not sort of judge things just because I find the title or the franchise it comes from to be sort of trite, or what came before to be sort of not what I would like. I don't know. It's taught me to sort of give a chance to things I normally probably wouldn't consider looking at, because I've been the beneficiary of people doing that for me.
Yeah, your VW bus is crushing it.
It's crushing something.
Well, I do think it's interesting though, because it's like, I don't know, like a good comic or a good story can come from anything, and that's
exactly.
And
that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times people they have preconceived notions about what something's going to be based off of what knowledge especially in 2017, where everything is I see it and I tweet about it. And no offense to Twitter, I'm a Twitter user, but at the same time, like, there is a very short path between idea and it being released into the world these days.
Yeah, pretty much everything is instantly published now.
Mm-hmm. And like, I think that's the preconceived notions can be very harmful to the nature of storytelling, because, like I said, a good story can come from anywhere.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And I think that what the important thing is to make stories that connect people that make people feel more connected to the universe, and that they recognize themselves in the characters, and whether or not those, and it's easy to do regardless of whether the characters are animals or robots or prehistoric people.
I have to admit, Flintstones made me a little bit concerned that I engage with screens too often, which is not something I expected out of a Flintstones comic.
Yeah, well, good.
That is good. I actually think we could be a little bit more conscientious about that stuff. But so the Flintstones comes to its pre-planned end with issue number 12. The comic itself has an episodic feel, but it carries a lot of themes and storylines onward throughout. Did knowing this series was 12 issues and out, which is fairly short in the grand scheme of comic book history, change your approach on the series as a whole?
Well, I wanted a longer story arc so you can see the journey that the characters take and watch them change over 12 issues. But I also wanted them to be very episodic and have a good solid ending point after each issue, as sort of a precaution against being canceled.
Sure.
So I figured, I could be canceled at any point. I'd experienced this with Prez, so I wanted to make sure that if it was canceled in the middle of the run, that I wasn't leaving somebody, in midair, like I sort of did with Prez. So it did change the way I wrote the Flintstones, and that I wanted to be both heavily episodic and yet have these sort of like longer running story arcs and themes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it works really well, and it actually, due to the nature of the Flintstones itself being episodic, it fits the like, I don't know, inherent knowledge we have of the property. So the last question I have for you is, I want to ask about Snagglepuss. You have a book. You already had the first 8-page story go in. God, I don't even remember what comic it was. It was like one of those the Hanna-Barbera meets DC character comics. But
yeah, it's one of those stories that you really have to give a chance to, because on the face of it, it just sounds too ridiculous to be good. But when you read it, it's actually it was really well done.
Yeah, it
was the Suicide Squad Banana Splits crossover.
Yeah, the Snagglepuss series is set to come, but in it, the character is now a gay Southern Gothic playwright Which, really, given what I know about Snagglepuss, just kind of feels like who he was already in a way.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And it's one of those ideas that, when you say it out loud, it seems so obvious. You wonder how nobody's ever done this before.
I kind of always want, that's the thing is like, was that just how they created him and nobody just ever talked about it? I don't know. It might have been. They didn't have interviews all the time back then. That might have just been how they created Snagglepuss. But
well, it's like when I was in high school, everyone knew who the gay kids were, but nobody cared as long as they didn't say they were gay, as long as they didn't come out of the closet and nobody was going to bother them. It wasn't really, it was just, expectation of you either conform to the social norms or you're silent. Mm-hmm. And I feel like, 1950s America was the same way. It's like everyone kind of knew Tennessee Williams was gay. They kind of knew that, Truman Capote was gay. They didn't really, that didn't bother them so much as, so long as they stayed in the closet.
Right.
It was the idea that you are going to threaten our Judeo-Christian norms by being explicit about it, that then we're going to do something horrible. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like that probably was in the cartoon too. They probably realized, well, Snagglepuss is a little bit of a sugarfoot, but he's obviously not gonna make out with Augie Doggy or
right,
anything. So as long as he keeps his candle in a bushel, they thought people would just accept it the same way they did other obviously homosexual figures in American pop culture at the time.
Mm-hmm. So now in 2017, why was it the time to take Snagglepuss out of the closet, and what can readers expect from the series when it comes?
Well, and because a lot of it is about how we live our own lives separate from public life, mm-hmm. and about how artists, whether it's because of their sexuality or because of their inner lives or for whatever reason, are often forced to live this sort of double life where what they put on the page is different than what they experience in real life, and how that sort of creates a conflict within the person. And so having a playwright writing, sort of like controversial and challenging work while having to be sort of a caricature of themselves in public, or having to sort of hide themselves away, their real life, to me felt like very natural in a way to write about like what it's like to sort of have to be creative within a closet.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I think is most fascinating about the book, I mean, it's obviously going to be it's was talked about quite a bit when the story first came out about it. But I never in a million years would have expected Howard Porter to draw that book. I know him as a Justice League artist. And then when I saw his stuff, I'm like, this is really good. This is amazing.
Yeah, he did great. Yeah, I liked his artwork a lot. He just did the 8-page sampler. There's going to be a different artist for the series. Oh,
okay.
But yeah, I'm glad. I asked Marie how we got Howard, and she said, "Oh, I called in a favor."
Yeah,
I thought he did a wonderful job on the artwork.
He did a really amazing job. So, do you have any idea when it's supposed to come out?
August.
Excellent. Well, I'm looking forward to it. Mark, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with writer Mark Russell. You can find Mark on Twitter at @ManRuss and his work in the Flintstones and DC Comics. If you're a fan of the show, there's some big news. Off Panel now has a Patreon. If you like the show and want to support it, consider backing it on Patreon at patreon.com/offpanel. There are fun rewards and insider information you can get if you do, including 2 new reward tiers that I added this week. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Kat McKenzie, Lou Iovino, Christopher Carter, Nicholas Kesslake, Paul Lai, Brian Dickerson, Greg Rucka, Ryan Mail, Adam Heifel, Nicholas Gardner, Andrew Corrigan, Fiona Staples, Chris Morris, Johan Barander, Chris O'Halloran, Mark Abnett, Matt Battaglia, Alec Bernal, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim DiMonacos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. Don't forget to like the show on Facebook at /sketched, that's SKTCHD, follow it on Twitter at @sketchcomic, or follow me at @slicefriedgold. Want more from Off Panel? Subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher and give the show a rating or review while you're at it. Quick thanks to the band Wolfpack, whose excellent track Outro from their album Volmilch opens and closes the show now.
Give them a listen as they're totally rad. Thanks for listening, and tune in later this week for another episode.